In today's video, we'll be looking at char cloth and brimstone matches. In particular, we'll be looking at how we make these rather than having to buy them in. Stay tuned. When natural materials burn, cotton, wood, jute, whatsoever, it's actually a chemical process going on. Now, there are three components to this: heat, fuel, and oxygen. The material we're burning, that's the fuel. It combines at high temperature with oxygen in the air to produce water molecules and carbon dioxide molecules. If there's not enough oxygen, you might be producing carbon monoxide molecules. But if the burning process is contained in a vessel in which oxygen is not allowed in, although hydrogen and other materials will come off of the burning material in the form of a gas, a highly flammable gas, the carbon itself is not converted into carbon dioxide and does not turn into that fine ash that it normally would turn into. Now, what you have is a material that is predominantly carbon. It's highly reactive, so even a faint spark from flint and steel, when combining with that material in air, where there is oxygen, will trigger off the chain reaction. And like charcoal, it will not so much burn, so much as turn into an ember that will glow and give off a great deal of heat. Actual flame, that's from the gases. This is why we use char tin to make char cloth. Char cloth is when we put cloth, usually cotton, into a box which is sealed but has a small ventilation hole. Now, that vent hole is usually 3 to 4 millimeters in diameter. Now, when it's placed in a fire or on glowing coals, it superheats the contents of the box, and all the gases that result from the breakdown of the material are released and come out of that vent hole as a highly flammable smoke. If you ignite that, you will watch the flame burn until it finally burns out. Not long after that flame is burned out, you remove the char box from the fire or the coals, as the case may be, and allow the box to cool. Once the box is cooled, when you open it, instead of pieces of cotton, you'll find pieces of char cloth. The main features of a char tin are a simple lid that seals. Almost any tin will do. There are candy tins, Altoid tins, and so forth. All that's required is a small hole. 3 or 4 millimeters in diameter is quite sufficient. This is an exhaust port. It allows the gases to escape. A good supply of makeup removal pads, which are made of 100% cotton, are a good and reliable source of material for making char cloth out of. It saves you from having to cut up clothing, and again, it's a reliable and inexpensive source of suitable material. I usually make about 5 pieces at a time, and we're good to go. Once we close the char tin up, it's placed on the hot coals of the fire, where it is allowed to heat up. Quite soon, we'll see smoke coming out of the exhaust port. The exhaust gases are quite flammable and also act as an excellent indicator as to what stage the char cloth is at. Once that flame burns out, we know that most of the material within the cotton fibers that we want to remove has been removed from the cotton, leaving us with almost the pure carbon. Of course, once the flame does burn out, it's usually a good idea to allow it to spend another couple, 3, 4, maybe 5 minutes on the coals, just to get the last of the excess gases out. Once it stops radiating heat and is cool to the touch, we can safely remove the char cloth, ready to use. It is important to allow the char box to cool down before opening it. Otherwise, premature exposure to air will ruin your batch. Being highly combustible, char cloth can catch a spark, even one of a relatively low temperature, making it ideally suited for use with flint and steel. And giving you a usable ember. Now it must be remembered that it's not just cotton cloth we can turn into char cloth. We can make other char materials as well. Some people, for example, make char rope. And we can explore some of these alternative options down the road. One of the most popular materials is punkwood. That is to say, wood which is dead and has begun to rot, and you have fungal growth within it. And these pieces make an excellent char material. Again, catching a spark easily, only they'll smolder for much longer. But the essential principle for making it is the same in every case. And as long as you have a char box, you're good to go. One proviso: if you're going to use it on a stovetop, it should preferably be a camp stove and done outside. I was able to do it indoors in the fireplace because we have a good chimney that took the smoke away. Do this in the house normally, and you'll have a house full of smoke. You will not be popular after that. Around 1500 years ago, the Chinese, and at about the same time the Romans, developed the brimstone match. This technology would last for over 1,000 years, until 1826, when the friction match, or the lucifer match as it was sometimes known, was invented. The lucifer wouldn't displace the brimstone immediately, but it was much more convenient, and so eventually, over the next 30 to 50 years, it pretty much completely displaced brimstone matches. And it had an important effect on society because the poor, up until this point, could make their own matches by simply acquiring a little bit of sulfur and a little bit of skill, whereas the friction match required a more sophisticated technology and ended up being made in factories rather than by simple poor people trying to earn a living. We're going to have a look at making some brimstone matches, and I'll show you a simple workstation that I use to prevent damaging the furniture and so forth. I will say it's important to follow safety rules here. If you wear glasses, wear them. If you don't wear glasses, wear safety glasses. if molten sulfur were to boil up and splutter on you, you get any of that in your eyes, the damage would be permanent. So do please, please, please follow the safety rules and be careful. Let's have a look at how it's done. So here I have a basic Brimstone match manufacturing workstation. This piece of wood is what we put the matches on to cool. And of course, using a scrap of wood to create a work surface is very helpful, particularly when you have drips of molten sulfur. You don't want to damage your furniture. Here I have a bottle of sulfur powder and a lighter to light the nightlight candle, which is contained in the tuna tin. Should we get an ignition, it's an easy way to put it out by having a damp cloth handy that we can simply smother the flames with. Coffee stir sticks make the perfect splints, and they're easily cut with a pair of scissors. It must be remembered that when making these, you want to cut on an angle because you want a tip, a point, and that will allow you to fairly easily and fairly accurately get your fire going, because if it's too thick, it won't catch as easily. You have to remember you're using these with an ember, so having a tiny amount of sulfur on the tip will ignite much more easily than a big blob. There are those who suggest that once they've cooled down, they dip them twice into the sulfur. I recommend against that because if you have too much sulfur, it'll tend to drip. And when sulfur drips, it's a little bit having like a miniature pool of napalm on your hands. It's just not helpful at all. And so we're just going to make half a dozen of these as a demonstration. And again, you would lay out your matches on your cooling block, and that way you can access them easily. This spoon, which was made from a thimble, is actually a replica of an example, an 18th century example that I've seen. And what I like about it is because it's a thimble, it's quite deep, and so I can just dip straight in. What I would say is you can use an ordinary spoon, a teaspoon for example, but you're going to dip at a much more shallow angle. If you wanted to use a modern spoon, which was a little bit deeper, something like a coffee measuring spoon would allow you to dip straight in. But one of the nice things about this 18th century copy is that it's very small, so we don't have to use too much sulfur at any given point in time, which I quite like. There's already sulfur that's cooled off in the bottom of this, but I'm going to take a little bit more of the sulfur powder, fill it up to more or less level. Put the cap back on that. And with our lighter, let's put that down. Just light our candle. At this point, we need to melt the sulfur. And the trick is to hold it over the flame, even rotate it around the flame a little bit. But what we don't want to do is plunge it too deeply into the flame or let it overheat. And this does take a couple of minutes to melt the sulfur because we're trying to do it very gently. If it starts giving off many fumes, you know you're overheating it. And again, when sulfur becomes hot and molten, it also becomes a bit sticky. So it's something we want to be careful about. And as you can see, it's starting to recede from the walls of the spoon. So it is melting nicely. We have a little bit floating in the middle. And there's a few fumes coming off, so I'm just going to raise this a little bit higher off the flame. Obviously, you want to do this in a well-ventilated area or outside, but if you are doing it indoors, well-ventilated is important, and not overheating it. So we've nearly melted all the sulfur, but we're going to wait for it to finish going molten. And this thimble is nearly full. Of the liquid sulfur. But do wait for all of the sulfur to finish liquefying. You don't want to start working on it prematurely. If you notice a blue flame, you've overheated it and it's caught fire. And this, of course, is where our damp towel comes in, but we'll come to that if we need to. So now I'm going to take a splint, dip it and pull it out. I'm going to let it drip back in because we don't want to have too much sulfur on the end of that. And then heat it a little bit more. I can see it's a delicate balance between being molten and solid, and you need it to be molten. And if it looks slushy, it's not quite hot enough. Again, allowing drips to come off. It may come out looking yellow, it may come out looking orange. When it's cooled down, it will be yellow. But if you're getting a lot of orange, part of it is overheating. And incidentally, I'm just going to show you, if you allow it to get too close to that candle and it catches too much heat, I usually try to avoid this, but let's do it on purpose. You can get a blue flame. If you see that blue flame, your sulfur's on fire. If you try to dip your splint into there, it will actually ignite. So this is where your damp paper towel comes in, because you can extinguish it quite easily. And then, again, being careful with the heating, you want to make sure your liquid is a liquid. If it is a bit slushy, you're going to pull out too much, and so just wipe the excess off on the inside of the spoon. And again, by moving the spoon around the heat, rather than, and again, it's caught. So again, we can extinguish it with the wet paper towel. It can be a bit fiddly at times. And one of the reasons for rocking the spoon back and forth is to see if the sulfur contained within is sitting still or if it's moving. I can again see that we're going a bit liquidy. It's a little bit sludgy, but if it is too much, we just wipe the excess off on the inside of the spoon and then set it to cool. Now, if you have a big blob like that come off, you do not want that. That is a disaster, so we just Stick it in there, allow that to melt down a little bit more, wipe off the excess, and now there's plenty of sulfur on that too. There we go. That'll work just fine, but it does mean I need to spend a little bit of time making sure that my sulfur is in suitable liquid form. Once dipped on both sides, the matches are allowed to cool, each match giving you 2 lights. The final product, a small bundle of Brimstone matches. Once an ember is lit, you can use that to ignite the sulfur. And the brimstone match can then be used to light your candle. Char cloth and brimstone matches. A relatively primitive technology, and yet still state-of-the-art less than 200 years ago. Not too difficult to make, not too difficult to use. Whether you're doing bushcraft, historical reenactment, experimental archaeology, or just are interested in the science of it. It's an interesting and fun project, but again, whenever dealing with fire, please remember you need to be careful because safety must always come first. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and we hope to see you again for our next. Until then, please like, share, and subscribe.